Maya sat rigid in her economy class seat, her fingers gripping her phone tightly. The humiliation still burned in her chest, but she refused to let it break her. She had texted her father about what happened, and his response was immediate. "Stay calm. I'm handling this now." Moments later, the flight intercom crackled to life. "Emma Carter, report to the cockpit immediately." The first-class flight attendant stiffened. The passengers around her paused, sensing the shift in the air. Emma smoothed her uniform, her usual confidence faltering for the first time, and made her way toward the cockpit. Inside, the captain's face was unreadable, his posture rigid. But his next words sent a chill down Emma's spine. "The girl you just humiliated, her father owns this airline." Emma's stomach dropped, her lips parted, but before she could form an excuse, the captain continued coldly. "Mr. Johnson is waiting when we land. You better have an explanation." The walls of control she had built around herself came crashing down, and for the first time in her career, Emma Carter was truly afraid. But before we dive deeper into the story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss out on the next one. JFK International Airport buzzed with life, a chaotic symphony of hurried footsteps, rolling suitcases, and overlapping voices from every corner of the world. The crisp scent of freshly brewed coffee drifted through the air from nearby kiosks, blending with the faint traces of jet fuel and expensive cologne. Bright digital screens flickered above, flashing departure times and gate changes in rapid succession, while the cool voice of the intercom made yet another announcement, barely distinguishable over the ambient noise of 1,000 conversations happening all at once. There was an unspoken energy in the air, a mixture of excitement, exhaustion, and quiet ambition. Some travelers rushed to make tight connections. Others strolled leisurely with first-class privilege, their designer luggage gliding effortlessly behind them. Among them, standing in the priority boarding line with a quiet but undeniable presence, was 17-year-old Maya Johnson. Dressed in a stylish yet understated outfit, a sleek, fitted blazer over a simple white top paired with dark-washed jeans and pristine sneakers, Maya carried herself with a kind of composure that made her seem older than she was. Her long, dark curls framed her sharp, inquisitive eyes, which flickered with both anticipation and the weight of responsibility. Slung over her shoulder was a designer backpack, a sleek leather piece embossed with a subtle luxury logo, not a fashion statement but a gift from her father, a reminder of how far she had come. Inside it, neatly packed, were the essentials of her journey: a carefully annotated journal, a well-worn novel, her laptop, and the acceptance letter that had changed everything. This flight wasn't just another trip, it was the beginning of something bigger. Her fingers tightened slightly around the crisp edges of her first-class boarding pass, a ticket not to extravagance, but to achievement. She had worked hard for this. The prestigious youth leadership program she was flying to attend in Los Angeles was selective, an opportunity granted only to the brightest young minds in the country. Maya had earned her place not through privilege but through late nights of studying, countless sacrifices, and an unshakable determination that her father had instilled in her since childhood. First class wasn't a luxury she flaunted. It was a symbol of her relentless pursuit of excellence, a reward for the countless hours spent proving herself in spaces where people like her were often underestimated. Still, there was a small knot of anxiety in her stomach, though she wouldn't let it show. Not because she doubted herself, she knew she belonged in this space just as much as anyone else, but because she was familiar with the silent biases that often lurked beneath polite smiles and casual dismissals. She had seen the way people sometimes hesitated before assuming she was the one in charge of a project, how their expressions flickered ever so slightly when they realized she was the top performer in the room. She had learned to navigate it with quiet confidence, never letting it shake her. But today, standing in the first-class boarding line, surrounded by well-dressed businessmen and elegantly groomed women, she could already feel the subtle weight of expectation pressing against her. She pushed it aside, straightening her posture, reminding herself that she belonged here. As the line moved forward, she exhaled slowly, slipping her phone into her pocket and adjusting the strap of her backpack. The flight attendant stood at the gate, scanning tickets with bright, rehearsed smiles. This was just another step toward her future. Just another flight. But as she handed over her pass and took her first step toward the jet bridge, she had no way of knowing that within minutes she would be standing at the center of an all-too-familiar battle, one she had faced before, but never on a stage quite like this. Emma Carter stood at the entrance to the jet bridge, her posture rigid, eyes flicking across the line of first-class passengers with the well-trained efficiency of someone who had worked in the airline industry for nearly 2 decades. She had seen all types of travelers come through these gates. The wealthy, the entitled, the stressed executives, the occasional celebrity whose presence sent a ripple of excitement through the staff. She prided herself on maintaining a standard of excellence, ensuring that first class remained a space of quiet luxury, free from unnecessary disruptions. And then her gaze landed on Maya Johnson. Something about the girl made Emma pause. The stylish yet modest outfit, the designer backpack, the calm confidence in the way she held herself. It was all there, yet something felt off. Her experience had taught her to read people, to identify who belonged and who was trying to slip through the cracks. And this girl? She didn't fit. First class wasn't just about the seat, it was about presence, about status, about a certain unspoken understanding of belonging. Emma had made a career out of spotting the ones who didn't. She narrowed her eyes slightly, watching as Maya stepped closer, handing over her ticket with a polite, almost indifferent air. But Emma had already made up her mind before the scanner even beeped. With a practiced smile, she intercepted, stepping in front of Maya before she could take another step toward the cabin. "Sweetheart," Emma said, her voice dripping with forced warmth. "First class isn't for everyone. Economy is down that way," she pointed down the aisle, as if guiding a lost child. Maya's heart dropped, a cold weight settling in her stomach. She had anticipated moments like this before, subtle microaggressions, polite skepticism, but the outright dismissal took her by surprise. Still, she refused to let it show. Tightening her grip on her boarding pass, she met Emma's gaze with quiet steadiness and held up the ticket. "This is my seat. I belong here," she said, her voice firm but controlled. Emma's smile faltered. There was no hesitation in the girl's tone, no embarrassment, no pleading, just certainty. The passengers nearby had paused, their conversations briefly stalling as their eyes flickered toward the interaction. Emma felt a prickle of irritation. She had seen this before, a misplaced sense of entitlement, someone trying to push their way into a space they hadn't rightfully earned. With a small sigh, she shook her head, refusing to take the ticket from Maya's outstretched hand. "There must be a mistake," she said smoothly, her voice now carrying the crisp edge of authority. "Let's not make a scene. Please, step aside." Maya didn't move. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, but she refused to shrink beneath the weight of the moment. "There is no mistake," she repeated, her voice steady despite the growing tension. "You can scan the ticket yourself." Emma's lips pressed together in a tight line. She could feel the eyes of the first-class passengers on her, some curious, others impatient. A few exchanged glances, waiting to see how this would unfold. Emma wasn't about to let this girl undermine her authority. She turned slightly, motioning to a nearby airport security officer. Within seconds, a uniformed man approached, his gaze flicking between Emma and Maya with mild confusion. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his tone neutral. "Yes," Emma said before Maya could speak. "This young lady is trying to sit in first class, but there's been a mistake with her ticket. I need her to be escorted to economy so we can keep boarding moving smoothly." Maya felt a sharp pang of disbelief. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't caused any disruption, yet here she was being treated like an intruder. She turned to the officer, trying to keep her frustration in check. "My ticket says first class," she said, holding it out. "I belong in that seat." The officer hesitated, glancing at Emma, who gave him a pointed look. He sighed, shifting awkwardly. "Ma'am, I think it would be best if you moved to economy for now. We can sort this out later." Maya clenched her jaw. "If I was someone else, would you be treating me like this?" Emma let out a quiet scoff. "Now let's not make this about something it's not," she said smoothly. "I'm just following protocol." Maya could feel the weight of the passengers' stares pressing down on her, their silent judgments forming in real time. Some muttered amongst themselves. "Maybe she's confused," a man near the gate murmured. A well-dressed woman, probably in her 50s, frowned slightly but said nothing, her expression unreadable. Across the boarding area, a black mother clutched her young daughter's hand a little tighter, her expression a mixture of recognition and quiet anger. Dana held sharply, willing herself to stay composed. Fighting would only make it worse. She had no choice. Holding her head high, she turned and walked toward economy, her face burning, but her dignity intact. As she reached her seat, she caught sight of a businessman in first class watching the scene unfold with amused detachment. He smirked, shaking his head slightly as he muttered under his breath, "Some people will do anything for an upgrade." Maya didn't react, but the words hit like a slap. She dropped into her seat, exhaling slowly. Her fingers moved automatically to her phone, her pulse thrumming in her ears as she typed out a message. "Yeah, the flight attendant humiliated me. She moved me to economy." The reply came almost instantly. "Stay calm, I'm handling this now." Emma strode through the first-class cabin with a quiet sense of triumph, her polished heels clicking against the plush carpeting as she moved toward the galley. The irritation she had felt earlier had melted into smug satisfaction, the kind that came from asserting control and ensuring order was maintained. She prided herself on keeping first class exactly as it should be, a sanctuary for those who truly belonged. Anything less was an affront to the carefully curated experience of luxury. As she reached the galley, she leaned against the counter and glanced toward her fellow flight attendant, a younger woman named Rachel who had witnessed the exchange at the gate. Rachel was still processing what had happened, her expression uncertain, her hands fidgeting with the neatly stacked glasses in front of her. Emma, sensing the hesitation, let out a quiet chuckle before shaking her head. "Some people just don't know their place," she muttered, her voice low but edged with self-assurance. "I fixed that." Rachel hesitated, her lips pressing together as if debating whether to respond. There was a flicker of something in her eyes, discomfort, maybe even doubt, but she merely nodded and went back to her task. Emma took that as agreement, as validation that she had handled the situation exactly as she should have. First class was a privilege, and privileges had to be protected. In economy, Maya sat stiffly in her seat, her hands curled around her phone, her fingers gripping the device tighter than necessary. The glow of the screen illuminated her face, highlighting the tightness in her jaw, the fire in her eyes that simmered beneath the surface. She could feel the humiliation pressing against her chest like a physical weight, but she refused to let it crush her. She would not cry. She would not break. The murmurs around her were soft, but not soft enough. Here, she really belonged in first class. She wouldn't have been moved, a middle-aged woman whispered to her companion a few rows ahead. Probably thought she could get away with it, a man muttered under his breath. Maya kept her gaze forward, her breathing slow and controlled, her expression unreadable. She had spent her entire life proving herself in spaces where she wasn't expected to thrive, where people assumed she was less than what she was. This wasn't new, but it never got easier. She pressed the call button above her seat, a small request for a glass of water, something to center herself. Minutes passed. Nothing. She pressed it again. Still, no one came. Across the aisle, a woman glanced at her, then at the unresponsive flight attendants further down the cabin. The silence stretched between them, an unspoken understanding hanging heavy in the air. Maya exhaled through her nose, her grip on her phone tightening. It was deliberate. She knew that now. A few seats away, a young black girl no older than 10 sat beside her mother, her wide, curious eyes darting between Maya and the rest of the cabin. There was no judgment in her gaze, only quiet observation, a silent recognition of something too familiar for her age. Her mother's hand rested gently over hers, a wordless reassurance, but there was sadness there too, the kind that came from knowing the world wouldn't always be kind. Maya felt that look, understood it deeply, but she didn't want pity. She wanted fairness. She wanted what she had earned. Her phone vibrated in her palm, another message from her father. "Stay calm, I'm handling this now." She took a breath, letting the words settle over her like armor. She didn't know exactly what her father planned to do, but she knew one thing for certain: Emma Carter had made a mistake, and soon she was going to realize just how big of one. The cockpit phone rang sharply, slicing through the quiet hum of the flight deck. The captain, a seasoned pilot with years of experience, reached for the receiver, his movements calm but precise. The moment he brought it to his ear, his expression shifted. At first, it was neutral, the kind of composed demeanor one expected from someone in charge of a multi-million-dollar aircraft. But as the voice on the other end spoke, his posture stiffened, his grip on the receiver tightening, his jaw clenched slightly. This wasn't just any call. The co-pilot, seated beside him, glanced over, sensing the sudden change in atmosphere. "Problem?" he asked cautiously. The captain didn't answer right away. His eyes remained fixed ahead, his mind processing the words being delivered to him with absolute clarity. Then, in a voice that was steady but undeniably sharp, he responded, "Understood." He placed the receiver back in its cradle, exhaled slowly, and without a second of hesitation, activated the cabin intercom. "Emma Carter, report to the cockpit immediately." The words rang through the cabin like a warning bell. Passengers barely noticed at first. Their attention focused on drinks, in-flight entertainment, or quiet conversations. But in first class, Emma Carter, who had just finished serving a champagne refill to a businessman, froze mid-step. Her fingers gripped the tray a little too tightly. She hadn't been expecting that. Rachel, the younger flight attendant standing near the galley, looked at her, brows raised. "Everything okay?" Emma forced a small smile, but her stomach had already begun to twist. "I'll be right back," she murmured, setting the tray down carefully before smoothing her uniform and making her way toward the cockpit. A call from the captain mid-flight wasn't unheard of, but something about the way it had been announced, so clear, so direct, sent a ripple of unease down her spine. As she walked through the aisle, she was unaware of how many passengers noticed her departure. Some didn't care, some barely registered the announcement, but one person did. Maya. She watched Emma walk past with careful, unreadable eyes, the tension in her shoulders betraying nothing. She didn't know what the call was about, but she had a feeling. Inside the cockpit, Emma stepped in, her professional demeanor firmly in place. "Captain, you needed to see me?" she asked, keeping her voice light, controlled. The moment she met his gaze, her stomach dropped. The warmth, the casual authority she had come to expect from him, gone. His expression was cold, disapproving, knowing. A heavy silence stretched between them before he spoke, his voice measured, calm, but carrying a weight that made the space feel suddenly suffocating. "That girl you just humiliated?" He let the question hang for a moment before delivering the blow. "Her father owns this airline." Emma's entire body went rigid. The words hit like a physical impact, knocking the breath from her lungs. The captain didn't move, didn't blink, just let the reality sink in. Let her process the full magnitude of what she had done. She stared at him, blinking rapidly, as if trying to convince herself she had misheard. She started, but nothing came out. Her throat was dry, her mind scrambled, reaching for an explanation, a defense, anything to undo the past 30 minutes. The captain didn't give her the chance. "I just got off the phone with Robert Johnson himself," he continued, his voice like steel. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Emma felt a wave of heat rush through her, a sickening mix of panic and disbelief. Robert Johnson. The name was instantly recognizable. Not just another executive, not just some rich businessman, the Robert Johnson, the CEO, the man who had built the airline from the ground up, the man whose influence in the industry was absolute. And she had just humiliated his daughter. Her lips parted again, but this time her voice wavered. "Captain, I didn't know." "That's the problem," the captain cut in sharply. "You didn't need to know." His glare hardened. "What matters is how you treated a paying passenger. You dismissed her, humiliated her, had her forcibly removed from the seat she rightfully paid for. And now you've put this entire flight under scrutiny." Emma's breath came faster now, her chest tightening. Her mind flashed back to the gate, to Maya's steady gaze, to the way she had stood her ground unshaken. She had thought the girl was just another nobody trying to push her way into a space she didn't belong. She hadn't imagined, she couldn't have imagined, who she really was. The captain's voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the severity beneath it. "Mr. Johnson is meeting this plane when we land, and he expects an explanation." Emma's heart pounded in her chest. She had handled difficult passengers before, had de-escalated conflicts, had prided herself on maintaining control. But this wasn't just a passenger complaint, this was career-ending. She had no doubt that by the time they reached their destination, half the executive team would already be aware of what had happened. Swallowing hard, she tried again, her voice more desperate now. Captain, I didn't mean—" "It's too late for that," he said bluntly. "You should be more concerned with how you're going to face him when we land." Emma stood there, frozen, the realization settling like a cold weight in her stomach. For the first time in her career, she had no control, and for the first time in her life, she was truly afraid. Emma moved through the cabin with a controlled urgency, her heart hammering in her chest. Her heels clicked against the floor, but this time the confidence that usually accompanied each step was gone. The moment she exited the cockpit, she felt the heat of the passengers' gazes, curious eyes following her as she made her way back toward economy. She could feel it, the shift in energy, the tension now simmering in the air, the whispers that had started to ripple through the cabin. People might not have known exactly what had just happened in the cockpit, but they could sense something had changed. She forced a pleasant expression onto her face, a practiced smile that had served her well for years. But her fingers clenched against the serving tray she had grabbed from the galley, the muscles in her shoulders tightening as she neared Maya's row. She had to fix this. Somehow, some way, she had to regain control of the situation before they landed. When she finally reached Maya's seat, she lowered her voice into a gentler, almost overly sweet tone, the kind she reserved for VIP passengers. "Ms. Johnson," she said smoothly, bending slightly to meet her eye level, "can I get you something? A warm towel? A meal from first class, perhaps? We have a special selection." Maya didn't move at first. Her gaze remained forward, locked on the back of the seat in front of her. The silence stretched long enough for Emma to feel the weight of it pressing down on her chest. Then, slowly, Maya turned her head and looked at her. The steel in that gaze hit like a slap. "No, thank you," Maya said, her voice quiet, steady, controlled. Emma's stomach twisted. The way she said it, there was no malice, no rage, just calm certainty, the kind that left no room for negotiation. A few passengers had noticed the interaction, their eyes flicking between Maya and Emma. The air around them seemed to hum with anticipation. Emma cleared her throat, trying to keep her composure. "Are you sure? I said no," Maya repeated, just as level as before. The response was a dismissal, not one made in anger but in complete disinterest. It was worse than a confrontation. It was worse than outrage. It was indifference. Emma straightened stiffly, her smile faltering for the first time. The warmth she had tried to project suddenly felt forced, and she could feel it cracking. She opened her mouth to say something else, but the words died on her tongue. The whispers started again. "Why is she suddenly being so nice? Isn't that the same flight attendant who moved her here? She's trying to fix something. You can see it all over her face." Emma felt her pulse spike. The passengers were watching, piecing things together. She had spent so much of her career controlling narratives, shaping perceptions, ensuring that everything ran smoothly under her watch. But now, the power was slipping, and she could feel it spiraling out of her grasp. She lingered for a second too long before forcing another tight-lipped smile and stepping back. Without another word, she turned and hurried back toward first class, ignoring the stares that followed her down the aisle. When she reached the galley, she braced herself against the counter, her hands trembling slightly. The murmurs from the passengers were growing louder. Some of them had seen her arrogance earlier, had watched her dismiss Maya as if she were insignificant. And now they were seeing something else entirely. Emma swallowed hard, closing her eyes for a brief second. She had been in difficult situations before, had dealt with demanding passengers, last-minute changes, high-pressure moments. But this was different. She wasn't just dealing with an irritated customer. She was dealing with the daughter of Robert Johnson, the man who could end her career with a single phone call. And worst of all, she had done this to herself. The reality was beginning to sink in, the consequences of her actions looming over her like a shadow. And yet the worst part wasn't just the fear of losing her job. It was the realization that no matter what she did now, it was too late. The damage was done. The plane touched down smoothly, its wheels screeching softly against the runway as it slowed to a controlled stop. A hush settled over the cabin, passengers stretching, reaching for their belongings, preparing for the usual rush to disembark. But for some, there was a strange tension in the air, an undercurrent of anticipation that hadn't been there before. Some had seen the way the flight attendant had changed her tune mid-flight, the desperate attempts to make amends. Others had caught the shift in Maya's demeanor, how she had gone from humiliated to poised, composed, as if she was merely waiting. Emma Carter sat stiffly in the galley, her fingers curled into her palms, nails pressing against skin. She had been in this position hundreds of times before, waiting for the doors to open, waiting to say her usual rehearsed goodbyes to first-class passengers as they exited. But this time, something was different. There was a tightness in her chest, a creeping sense of dread that made it hard to breathe. Outside the window, a sleek black SUV rolled up to the private tarmac entrance, its glossy surface reflecting the airport lights. The vehicle came to a slow, deliberate stop, the kind that commanded attention. The door opened and Robert Johnson stepped out. He wasn't alone. Two senior airline executives flanked him, their expressions unreadable, but their presence unmistakable. This wasn't a routine visit. This was an intervention. Inside the plane, passengers were already whispering, some craning their necks to get a better view through the windows. They didn't know exactly what was happening, but they knew something was off. Maya, still seated in economy, simply watched. She hadn't touched her phone since her father's last message. There had been no need. She knew him. When Robert Johnson said he would handle something, he meant it. Emma swallowed hard, her throat dry. The usual chatter in first class had dimmed, some of the passengers sensing the unusual presence outside. Then the seatbelt sign flicked off, and the doors unlocked with a faint hiss. The lead flight officer opened the exit, stepping aside as Robert ascended the stairs with effortless authority. The moment he entered the cabin, everything changed. There was something about him. His presence alone commanded respect. He wasn't loud, he wasn't aggressive, but there was a quiet power in the way he carried himself, in the way his sharp eyes scanned the cabin with precision. His gaze flicked to first class first, passing over the passengers who suddenly seemed much quieter than before. Then slowly it shifted toward economy, locking onto Maya. He moved toward her without hesitation, his polished shoes silent against the floor. When he reached her row, he crouched slightly, just enough to meet her gaze on level ground. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low, warm, but laced with a weight that only she could fully understand. Maya exhaled slowly, nodding. "I'm okay." For a second, his gaze softened, as if checking for any lingering hurt beneath her composed exterior. When he was satisfied, he straightened and turned, his expression hardening as he scanned the cabin once more. His gaze landed on the front of the plane, where Emma still stood frozen near the galley, her fingers gripping the service cart as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. Robert took his time walking toward her, each step deliberate, each second stretching unbearably for the woman who knew exactly what was coming. "Miss Carter," he said finally, his voice even, unreadable. Emma's mouth opened slightly, then closed. She couldn't seem to find her voice. Her hands shook slightly at her sides, her carefully constructed composure cracking. "I understand there was an issue with my daughter's seat," Robert continued. And though his words were measured, there was no mistaking the edge behind them. Emma swallowed, scrambling for words, for something, anything, to fix what had already spiraled beyond her control. "Mr. Johnson, I didn't know she was your daughter. If I had known—" Robert's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "The issue," he interrupted smoothly, isn't that you didn't know who she was. The issue is that it shouldn't have mattered." Emma's breath hitched. "You assumed she didn't belong," Robert continued, his tone dangerously calm, "and based on that assumption, you humiliated her, you dismissed her, you had her forcibly removed from a seat she rightfully paid for." He tilted his head slightly, his gaze never wavering. "Tell me, Miss Carter, is that how you treat all first-class passengers, or just the ones who don't look the way you expect?" The question landed like a blow. A heavy silence filled the cabin, passengers now completely still, watching, listening. Emma's face was pale, her hands trembling. I wasn't," she stammered, voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean—" Robert sighed quietly, shaking his head. "Miss Carter," he said, voice crisp, decisive. "Effective immediately, you are relieved of your duties." Emma's entire body stiffened. "Invigorated, I expect you to turn in your badge and credentials the moment you step off this plane," he continued. "Your employment with this airline is terminated." A soft, collective gasp rippled through the passengers. Some of them had suspected this was coming, but hearing it aloud, witnessing the moment of consequence, it was something else entirely. Emma's lips parted, but no words came. For the first time in her career, she had no power, no authority, no control over the narrative. Robert didn't give her a chance to argue. He turned to one of the executives beside him. "Make sure she's escorted off the premises the moment she steps off." The executive nodded once, already reaching for the paperwork that would officially seal her termination. Emma took a shaky step back, her head spinning. Just minutes ago, she had stood in this very cabin, feeling untouchable, secure in the authority she had wielded for years. Now, she was nothing more than another former employee with nowhere to run. Passengers watched as she took slow, unsteady steps toward the exit, her usually sharp posture now slumped in defeat. She hesitated for half a second at the door, as if hoping someone, anyone, might intervene. No one did. As she disappeared down the stairs, Robert exhaled, then turned back toward his daughter. Maya met his gaze, a quiet understanding passing between them. It was over. Justice had been served. Robert took a slow breath, his expression composed but carrying the weight of the moment. His first priority was his daughter. Before addressing anyone else, he turned to Maya, stepping past the tension-filled stares and the thick silence that had settled over the cabin. When he reached her, he crouched slightly, lowering himself to her level, his voice quiet but firm. "Are you okay?" Maya met his gaze, her face calm, but there was something deeper there, something only he could recognize. The quiet exhaustion, the weight of being questioned, the unfairness of having to defend herself in a place she had every right to be. It was an expression he had seen before, not just in her but in himself, in others who had been forced to carry the burden of proving their worth in spaces that should never have questioned them in the first place. But she was strong. He had raised her to be strong. "I'm okay," she said, her voice steady. He studied her for a second longer as if making sure, then gave her a small nod, the kind only a father and daughter could understand, a silent promise. This wasn't over yet. Straightening, Robert turned, his entire demeanor shifting. The warmth he had held for Maya vanished, replaced with something colder, sharper, more lethal. His gaze locked onto Emma Carter, who still stood frozen near the galley, her hands trembling slightly against the edge of the service cart. She looked as if she wanted to disappear, to melt into the walls, but there was nowhere left to hide. Robert walked toward her with the slow, deliberate steps of a man who held absolute power. The passengers were completely silent now, their gazes darting between him and Emma, the weight of the confrontation making the air in the cabin feel suffocating. Some were wide-eyed, some shifting uncomfortably, others watching with quiet, unreadable expressions. Emma finally found her voice, but it was weak, hesitant. "Mr. Johnson, I didn't know." "You didn't recognize my daughter," Robert said, his voice cutting through her words effortlessly. "That's not the problem." He paused, letting the silence stretch, letting her feel the full gravity of what was coming next. Then, in a tone like ice, he continued, "The problem is that You assumed she didn't belong." Emma's breath caught, and for the first time her carefully crafted composure cracked completely. Her face turned pale, her hands gripping the cart so tightly that her knuckles whitened. I wasn't trying to—" "Don't lie to me," Robert interrupted smoothly, his voice calm but carrying a weight that made it impossible to ignore. "We both know exactly what you were trying to do." Emma swallowed hard, glancing around desperately as if searching for some kind of support, but there was none. The other flight attendants wouldn't meet her eyes. Rachel, who had stood beside her during the first-class boarding, looked down, her lips pressed together in silent discomfort. Passengers sat frozen, some watching with rapt attention, others shifting, unsure if they should feel guilty for not speaking up earlier. A businessman in first class, the same one who had smirked at Maya being sent to economy, now looked deeply uncomfortable, his confidence draining as the reality of the situation settled in. The wealthy woman who had remained silent at the gate now crossed her arms, her gaze flickering between Emma and Robert, her lips pressed into a firm line. Emma tried again, her voice breaking. "It was a misunderstanding. I made a mistake." Robert tilted his head slightly, his expression unwavering. "A mistake." He let the word hang for a moment before continuing. "A mistake is misplacing paperwork. A mistake is bringing the wrong meal order. What you did wasn't a mistake, it was a choice." Emma flinched. "You chose to humiliate my daughter. You chose to ignore her ticket. You chose to escalate the situation instead of correcting your bias. You chose to call security on her," Robert said, his voice never rising but somehow cutting deeper than if he had shouted. Emma opened her mouth again, desperate now, but Robert had already made his decision. "You're fired," he said, his voice final, absolute. "Effective immediately." The words hit like a physical force. Emma's body went rigid, her breath hitching as if she had been punched in the gut. For a second, it seemed as if she couldn't fully process what had just happened. The passengers remained utterly still, as if collectively holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Then, slowly, the sound of clapping filled the air. It started as a few hesitant beats, a soft ripple of applause coming from the back of the cabin. Then it grew. More passengers joined in, their hands meeting with growing force, the sound spreading like a wave. Some clapped with quiet satisfaction, others with outright enthusiasm. The businessman who had looked uncomfortable before now clapped reluctantly, his gaze darting away as if realizing too late that he had been on the wrong side of this situation. Emma stood there, frozen, her face burning with humiliation as the sound of applause surrounded her, crushing her in a way that no words ever could. Robert didn't wait for another response. He turned to one of the senior executives who had followed him onto the plane. "Escort her off immediately," he said, his voice cool, unaffected. The executive nodded, stepping forward. "Ms. Carter, please gather your things." Emma still didn't move. Her chest rose and fell in uneven breaths, her eyes darting from Robert to the passengers as if looking for someone to tell her this wasn't happening. But there was no saving her now. She was done. Emma's steps were slow, almost hesitant, as she walked down the aisle, her polished heels now feeling unbearably heavy against the cabin floor. The weight of 100 silent stares bore down on her, each one pressing into her like an invisible force. Her usual air of authority was gone, stripped away in mere moments, leaving behind nothing but the hollow remnants of what little power she had clung to. Her hands trembled as she clutched the edge of her uniform, her breathing shallow. She had never felt so small. Passengers didn't look away. They watched, some openly, some from the corners of their eyes, as she made her slow, humiliating exit. Their faces carried a mix of emotions, some filled with satisfaction, others with quiet judgment, and a few with something close to pity. But none of them spoke. None of them tried to intervene. They had seen what she had done. They had watched her tear down a young woman who had done nothing wrong, and now they were watching the consequences unfold before them. Whispers trailed in her wake. She really thought she could get away with it. Serves her right. I knew something was off about her attitude earlier. The businessman who had smirked when Maya was sent to economy shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his earlier arrogance replaced with something uneasy. He cleared his throat, looking away as if suddenly ashamed of the moment he had relished only an hour before. The wealthy woman who had remained silent at the gate now watched Emma with a look of quiet disapproval, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable but firm. Emma felt the burn of humiliation creep up her neck, her face flushed red as she reached the front of the plane. The senior executive stood by the exit, his expression neutral but expectant, no sympathy, no second chances. Without a word, he extended his hand, waiting for her to surrender her airline badge. Her fingers hesitated as they reached for the small emblem pinned to her uniform, the same badge she had worn proudly for years, the one that had once represented authority, security, and power. Now, it meant nothing. Slowly, with shaking hands, she unpinned it and placed it in his palm. The executive nodded once. "This way." Emma stepped onto the jet bridge, the noise of the cabin fading behind her. As the doors closed, sealing her fate, the last thing she heard was the distant, unmistakable sound of applause. The days following the incident were anything but quiet. News of what had happened on board the flight spread quickly, first through whispers among passengers, then through staff members at the airline, and finally, across social media. Someone had recorded the moment Robert Johnson fired Emma Carter, and while the video didn't capture every detail, it was enough to send shockwaves through the industry. Headlines surfaced, debating the deeper implications of the event, some praising Robert for taking action, others dissecting the layers of unconscious bias that had led to it in the first place. Robert wasted no time in taking action. Within a week, his airline announced a new mandatory diversity and inclusion training program for all employees, from flight attendants to top executives. It wasn't a PR move, it was a necessity. He knew that what had happened to Maya wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a much larger issue, one that required more than just a single firing to fix. The training wasn't just about policies or surface-level understanding. It was about confronting biases, recognizing the moments where discrimination festered in subtle ways, and ensuring that every passenger, regardless of race, gender, or background, was treated with the dignity they deserved. Meanwhile, Emma Carter had vanished from the airline's ranks, her name now spoken in hushed tones by those who had once worked alongside her. For weeks, she stayed away from everything: her job, the industry, even the people who had supported her. At first, there was resentment, an anger that burned in the pit of her stomach, not at the consequences, but at the fact that she had been the one to face them. But as the days passed and the world continued to move forward, that anger turned into something quieter, something more uncomfortable. Reflection. She thought about every moment leading up to that flight, every assumption she had made about Maya the second she saw her standing in the first-class line. She had told herself it was instinct, that it was about keeping things in order, but deep down, she knew better. It had been bias, ingrained and unchecked, the kind that whispered in the back of her mind without her even questioning it. One evening, after rereading an article about the airline's new training initiative, Emma sat at her kitchen table, staring at a blank email draft. She hesitated, fingers hovering over the keyboard. Then, slowly, she began to type. It wasn't a plea for her job back. It wasn't an attempt to undo what had already been done. It was something she should have done the moment she realized she had been wrong. A sincere apology. Dear Mr. Johnson, I don't expect forgiveness, nor do I deserve it. But I need you to know that I see it now. What I did was more than a mistake. It was a reflection of something deeper that I should have confronted a long time ago. I am sorry. Not just to you, but to Maya. She didn't deserve what I did to her. No one does. I want to do better. I need to do better. If there is anything I can do to make this right, even if it means learning from the sidelines, I am willing. Emma Carter. She hit send before she could talk herself out of it. When Robert received the email, he read it twice, then leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. He had fired many employees in his career, but few had ever reached back out, let alone with something this candid. He wasn't a man who made decisions based on emotion, but he did believe in accountability. People could change, but only if they wanted to. After consulting with his team, he made his decision. 2 months later, Emma was reinstated under strict probation. She wouldn't return as a lead flight attendant. Instead, she would undergo extensive training, attend every inclusion seminar, and, perhaps most importantly, listen. If she slipped again, if she so much as treated another passenger unfairly, she would be gone. No second chances. But for now, she had one opportunity to prove that she had learned from the experience. For Maya, the whole ordeal had been exhausting, frustrating, and at times deeply unfair. But it had also been something else, eye-opening. She had always known that the world worked differently for people like her, that she would always have to fight a little harder, stand a little taller, prove herself a little more than others. But now she understood something even more important. Her voice carried weight. Her refusal to back down had sparked something bigger than herself. Weeks after the incident, Maya found herself back at the airport, this time boarding another flight with her father. The experience felt different now. There was no hesitation when she stepped into the first-class line, no subtle glances questioning whether she belonged. When she handed her boarding pass to the flight attendant at the gate, the woman smiled warmly. "Welcome aboard, Miss Johnson." She returned the smile, a quiet but knowing exchange passing between them. As she settled into her seat, she glanced around the cabin, observing the staff as they moved through first class. Their interactions were professional, polished, and most importantly, equal. There were no side glances, no hesitant pauses, just service, just respect. A flight attendant approached her row, a different woman this time, with a kind expression and a soft smile. "Can I get you anything to drink?" she asked. Maya met her eyes. There was no tension, no condescension, just a simple question from one human being to another. "Yes," she said, her voice steady. "Water would be great, thank you." As the flight attendant walked away, Maya turned toward her father, who was watching her with a quiet pride. She didn't need to say anything. He already knew what she was thinking. Change wasn't always easy, it wasn't always immediate, but it was always worth fighting for. Discrimination isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a quiet dismissal, a glance that lingers a second too long, a decision made before you've even spoken a word. Sometimes it's being told you don't belong in a place you've earned, and sometimes it's having to fight for respect that should have never been questioned in the first place. Maya's story is one that too many people can relate to. Whether it's in a boardroom, a classroom, or an airport terminal, the weight of being judged before you even have a chance to prove yourself is something that lingers long after the moment has passed. But what happened on that flight was more than just an isolated incident. It was a reflection of something bigger, a reality that many face daily but rarely see consequences for. Emma Carter thought she had the power to decide who belonged. She believed her assumptions were enough to dictate someone else's experience. But in the end, she learned that assumptions have consequences. She lost her job, her reputation, and the unshakable confidence that had once made her feel untouchable. But was firing her enough? Should she have been given a second chance? Some might argue that she deserved to lose everything, that people like her rarely face real accountability, so when they do, the punishment should be absolute. Others might say that change only happens when people are forced to confront their mistakes, that redemption is just as important as justice. What does true justice look like? Is it about punishment, or is it about making sure people learn, grow, and never repeat the same mistakes again? And more importantly, what would you have done if you were in Maya's position? Would you have fought back right away, or would you have waited like she did, knowing that sometimes silence holds more power than words? Comment below with your thoughts. Let's talk about it. Let's challenge the way we see privilege, power, and fairness. Let's push for a world where no one has to justify the space they rightfully belong in. And if you believe in standing up for what's right, if you believe in holding people accountable, if you believe in fighting for dignity and respect for everyone, hit that subscribe button. Because this isn't just a story, it's a conversation. And it's one we need to keep having.